Chandré Gould is a Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding scholar with the Wilson Center's Africa program and is also a senior research fellow with the Institute for Security Studies. She's been researching violence prevention in South Africa. And Chandré, thank you for joining us. Great to have you here.
Thank you, John. Nice to be here.
Let me ask you first to describe the type of violence that you're focusing on.
So South Africa experiences very high levels of violence, and we've struggled with this for many, many years, from long before the transition to democracy, in fact. And although levels of violence overall, as measured by homicide rates, for example, have decreased since 1994 and the transitional period, they remain very high. So we've got high levels of violent crime in South Africa and high levels of crimes and violence that affects women and children in particular. So my concern in this research project anyway is around violence against women and children and what we need to do to prevent that.
Mm-hmm. So a comparison and contrast between what's happening in the US versus what's happening in South Africa. Are we talking about something that's very similar, or are these very different situations?
Interesting that you raise that, John, because so if one looks at the homicide level overall, which isn't always a very helpful measure because, of course, it differs enormously from one
some
community
places
to
zero
another.
risk compared to
Exactly.
high risk. Yes.
So in terms of overall homicide levels, South Africa is amongst the top 10 countries in the world. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are some communities that are very, very safe to be in. I live in one such community, but there are other communities that are very dangerous. And if one looks at comparing South Africa and the US, what I found interesting when I arrived was looking at some of the homicide statistics and noticing, first of all, that they're not that easy to access. They're not always up to date, but for that there are a number of cities in the US that have levels of homicide that are comparable to some of the most dangerous places in South Africa.
And we tend to pay attention to high-profile acts of violence, the Parkland shooting, for example. But reading your materials, I think there's this insidious, ongoing lower level of violence that's happening every day, usually within households.
Exactly, and I would say that that kind of violence is foundational. When things aren't going right at home, when your home is not your sanctuary, when you're having conflict and violence and you're afraid at home, that tends to spill over into other environments. So we see through research in South Africa that children who are the most likely to get involved in bullying and fights at school are the kids who are also experiencing trouble at home.
Well, and that speaks to the lasting impact. The violence doesn't end when the act ends.
Absolutely not.
So what are the implications for society, for children and women in the group that you're focusing on?
Well, I think one of the most interesting implications is the effect that has on our economy. So we know from research that's been done in South Africa that violence against women and children costs us both indirectly and directly. So in other words, cost to the health system, cost to the criminal justice system, cost to productivity, cost to absenteeism from work,
so you can put a price tag on these things.
You can, and it amounts to about 7% of GDP each year. That's a lot of money.
Yes.
Being spent on something that can be prevented.
So is there a difference between, say, developing countries and developed countries? Or are we talking about something that unfortunately is part of human nature and more universal than that?
I think it is pretty much universal, but unfortunately violence tends to concentrate around areas of poverty and in areas of disadvantage, with one kind of adversity building upon another. So if you're really struggling to make ends meet, you're probably pretty stressed, which probably means that you are more likely to shout at your kids, hit your kids, you know, which is not to say that poor people are more violent than rich people. Far from it. I think that's not the case at all. But I think that when you're dealing with lots of adversities built upon one another, that's when you increase the risk factors.
Rich
for
people
violence.
just may have less desperate moments in their life or something like that. But not. I have in front of me a policy brief that you are a co-author of from the Institute for Security Studies, Reducing Violence in South Africa. Before I ask you about some of the particulars about it, I want to ask you, you told me before we began recording, there's a unique authorship of this document. Would you share that with our viewers?
Sure. John, I think one of the exciting things happening in South Africa and why I feel pretty optimistic despite the fact that we have high levels of violence is because over the last 4 years, government, non-governmental organizations and academics have started coming together in a new kind of way to build relationships across the sectors and think together, how do we solve this problem? You know, it's not very often that happens in a sustained kind of way.
Right.
And one of the consequences of that is that this policy brief, which makes the case for why we should be spending more government money on preventing violence, is that one of the authors is from government herself. So it's academics, NGOs, and government officials that have authored
Is
this
that unusual?
policy brief. It's enormously unusual. You just don't have.
How did you get her to do it?
Well, the nice thing is she wanted to, and she made a real intellectual contribution to this policy brief. And the department that she works for, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, is really key to driving change in our country. So wonderful to have her on board.
Well, I want to tell those of you watching us that if you'd like a copy of this, it's available on the website. And the name of the policy brief is Reducing Violence in South Africa, and you can download your own copy. I want to ask you about some things in here. One of them that jumps out at me is there's no reliable evidence that more police and more people in prison leads to less crime.
I'm afraid that is the case.
So it won't be a simple answer here. There's no simple solution.
No, there is no simple solution. And I think particularly in what is very clear from the research internationally and in fact from the United States is where there is no certainty that the deterrent of, for example, a long prison sentence will come into play. In other words, when it's not sure that if you commit a crime, you're going to be caught for it, and it very seldom is, then that deterrent effect of the threat of a long sentence stops being effective. And I think that in South Africa, it's very clear. You know, we're arresting about 1.6 million people a year. At any one time, over the last 10 years, there haven't been more than 164,000 people in prison. So it gives you an idea of just how many cases fall out. And that's also, I mean, when I interviewed men in prison, some of them for very serious violent crimes, they were often had been arrested for maybe 1 out of 100 crimes that they had committed. So really acting after an offence and expecting the criminal justice system to make an impact on what is really a deep social problem is expecting too much.
Yeah, and really at that point you're talking about reacting to the problem, not solving the problem.
Absolutely.
So what works? I mean, this sounds so primal, it almost sounds unmanageable. It's so large. But I'm sure there are things you're trying and that you're seeing some results. So what are some examples of the types of interventions or programs that can actually move the needle?
So I think that what we're seeing researchers saying over and over again is that we have to intervene at the level of the family, at the level of the neighborhood and so on. And one of the things that I've been doing over the last 3 years is working with a community-based organization and the University of Cape Town to evaluate whether we can bring about a change in a whole community's approach to parenting, towards positive parenting, by implementing 4 evidence-informed parenting programs that cover the life course. And what we are seeing is that, in fact, over the last year of delivering these parenting programs and assessing their impact, we're beginning to see changes. Parents are relying on corporal punishment less than they were before. They're learning how to praise and reward their kids. In other words, we're having better relationships building between parents and children. And hopefully, it'll take a while. That will have an impact on not only on violence in the community, but educational outcomes, health outcomes, mental health outcomes as well. These are the kinds of things we need to be doing.
And please forgive me if I'm being too superficial with my interpretation of this, but what the studies are showing is that strict parenting doesn't work in the sense that it introduces violence into the equation that the child will act out later in life. Is that what the evidence shows?
Pretty much. Pretty much, absolutely.
And yet we cling to some of these old-fashioned notions about, you know, spare the rod, spoil the child, or things like that. How do you deal with that? Because some of that is addressing culture or maybe even religious beliefs.
Absolutely, John. And I think that people are very attached to this idea that smacking your children is a good thing. And one of the arguments we often hear is, you know, I was smacked and I'm fine.
Right.
You know,
which is always debatable when people tell you they're fine.
Exactly. But I think that this, you know, it's going to be a gradual process of showing alternatives. Certainly what we've seen in our community is that when parents do have alternatives to corporal punishment and they know what they can do in a situation where a child needs to be disciplined, other than being smacked, then they use those alternative forms of discipline to great effect.
Does the level of activity in addressing the problem match the scope of the problem?
Not yet, unfortunately. I think that what we need at this stage is real high-level political buy-in. We need the president, the vice president. We need everybody in South Africa to be talking about this and to be talking about the solutions. We need to be very clear that just talking about shooting criminals and addressing the problem through policing is not going to solve it in the long run. So I think high-level political buy-in would be enormously helpful at this point.
Chandré, your term here at the Wilson Center is coming to a close. Is that right? It's soon? Yes, a couple of weeks. Tell us what you have planned and what you'll be doing when you return home, and has this been a useful experience for you?
It's been a fabulous opportunity, John. Not only have I been pushed to really define what I'm thinking very clearly for an audience that I'm not used to addressing, which is very helpful, but also to be able to have the time to network and meet such a wonderful array of people as there are in Washington has been great. When I go back home, I arrive the day before we start a workshop with high-level government officials.
No time to decompress, hit the ground
Not at
running.
all. And it's really wonderful because it's a workshop that will get them speaking about what they can be doing to prevent violence against children better. So there couldn't be a better way to get home.
Well, there's no doubt of the importance of your work, and thanks for sharing it with us today, and continued good success to you. Good luck.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chandré.